Hello to all my Intro Psych students. This is Intro Psych Developmental Psychology, Part 2. We're going to be talking about prenatal development today for a bit. Just sent an attachment to all of my Intro Psych students via email. Would you read it and read it closely and respond if you need to? I just tried to update you with some of what I know. You all know we're staying with this format the rest of the semester, and apparently summer session 1, I don't know if any of you are taking that, will also be online. I'm teaching summer session 2 later in the summer, and I don't think a decision has been made yet whether that's going to be online or back to the classroom. I would certainly like back to the classroom. Okay, so to start with, if you haven't watched part 1 of Developmental Psych, which is what we're covering in Intro, would you watch that first before you watch this? Developmental Psych is such a huge area that I'm dividing it down into different lectures, and this is the second in a series of maybe 3 or 4. We're going to be talking today about prenatal development. And again, I want to remind you that your textbook is utterly critical at this point, since we're not face-to-face. And would you go to your textbook and read the material that corresponds to prenatal development? Okay, so just to get the ball rolling, let me start by defining what prenatal development really is. We're looking at all of the developmental things that are going on physically from the moment of conception until the moment of birth. In a full-term delivery, a full-term baby, a full-term delivery runs about 38 weeks. And to say the obvious, the more premature an infant is, some of you might have been preemies, the greater the risks and the greater the challenges. So a full-term delivery is on average 38 weeks. A little bit shorter than that, a little bit longer than that is not a big deal. But especially when infants are born in a very premature state, since their body is so underdeveloped and their weight is so low, they have extra risk factors. So here's one of the ways I'd like to ask you to think about prenatal development. Our development, the first environment in which you've ever lived was inside your mom. It wasn't the day you were born and the day that you were born into your particular family. It started at the moment of conception. So the first 9 months of our lives, we are living in the environment of in utero, in the uterus. And the quality of this environment has everything to do with how we develop prenatally before birth. If mom is healthy, if mom takes good care of herself, if a pregnant woman avoids doing certain sorts of things which increase the risk on the developing fetus, then things generally go pretty well as planned. But if that doesn't happen, of course, to say the obvious, then a child could be born with certain sorts of problems already present. A simple example would be a child born with fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS, which is talked about in the book. Since alcohol is a very small molecule, when mom drinks, the developing baby is drinking. The molecule of alcohol is so small that it can easily move through the placenta and go from the mother's blood supply into the fetal blood supply. And since the brain is developing prenatally, the exposure to certain amounts of alcohol can actually alter the development of the cortex of the brain, which is never good news. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But let me start with what happens at the moment of conception. At the moment of conception, your genotype, genotype, is established. And that is your unique genetic construction. And the only time there's anybody else in the world who has the same genotype as you is if you are one half of a monozygotic twin pair. Now, monozygotic, mono, M-O-N-O, means one. Zygotic comes from the word zygote, as zygote, Z-Y-G-O-T-E, is a fertilized egg cell. Your biological brothers and sisters, same biological mom and dad, share about 50% of the genotype in common with you, but there's another 50% of your genotype that makes you uniquely you. So the only exception is if you're an identical twin. But other than that, there's 50% of your genotype that differs from your biological siblings. And that's why in the same family, with the same parents, one child could be born genetically more at risk for a certain sort of disorder, and another child getting a 50% different mix could be genetically less at risk. We see this, for example, with the bipolar disorder, which is its roots in genetics. We see it also with schizophrenia. So your genotype, though, refers to your unique genetic structure. So we need to separate that from something called phenotype. phenotype. Your phenotype is your physical self, your appearance, your height, the color of your skin, the shape of your body. That's your phenotype. Now, your phenotype is obviously partly tied to your genetics, but not completely. Could you have a genotype to be very tall, but have grown up in childhood with significant nutritional deficiencies, such that even though you were genetically programmed to be very tall, the lack of good nutrition in childhood turns you into, you're shorter than you would have been otherwise? Or could you have been born with a genotype to have a lot of intellectual ability, to be very smart? Could a lousy childhood environment create a phenotype where you're not able to use all of the gifts that you were given genetically, right? So genotype is purely genetic. Your phenotype is partly based on your genetics, but also tied to the kind of life that you live. All right, so let me just mention to you some of the genetic pieces that relate to psychology. I just mentioned one a minute ago. Intelligence, an individual's IQ level, is partly based on genotype, not completely. But it is partly based on genotype. Some babies are born genetically programmed to have higher IQs than others. Now, again, what happens in the environment can shape that. Some personality traits have some link to genetics. An example would be shyness, extreme shyness. Shyness, it turns out, based on some pretty good research, is partly genetic. There are other personality traits, though, that as far as we can tell have nothing to do with genetics and have much more to do with the way a child is raised and influenced by the family and the world around him or her. Certain psychological disorders clearly have a genetic vulnerability. We've talked about this earlier in the semester. The bipolar disorder runs in families genetically. Now, that doesn't mean if you have a mom or dad who's bipolar, it doesn't mean that you're destined genetically to become bipolar. But are you mathematically more at risk? Yes, you are. The same is true for schizophrenia. The same seems to be true for alcoholism. And then with depression, it depends. Since there's many different types of depression, some types of depression seem to have a stronger genetic loading or genetic vulnerability, while other types of depression clearly have much more to do with environmental factors. So you notice we're always going back to that nature-nurture piece that we keep talking about. Another quality in you and me is called inborn temperament, Temperament. Those of you who have been around newborn babies know that right at the moment of birth, babies are different in terms of their inborn temperament. And that is partly tied to genetic differences. If you ask your parents what the story is on you in the terms of your temperament in the first 6 to 12 months of your life. Some babies are born with a genetically, what's called an easy temperament. They tend to be flexible. They tend to be pretty mellow. They tend to be laid back. And that's not something they've learned. They were born that way. I feel a Lady Gaga song coming on, but I'm not going to sing it. But I'm thinking it in my mind. Okay, so babies born with an easy genetic temperament, they tend to make parents feel like real success stories. These are the babies, they get on a schedule pretty quickly, they don't cry that much. When they're upset and you do your mommy and daddy magic, you can calm them down pretty readily. And it makes you feel like a superstar as a parent. But part of what's going on is your kid was born with an easy temperament. Now, there's also a second temperament that's kind of the opposite. It's a baby that's born with what's called a difficult temperament. And just right away, you see the problem with words. When we label one baby difficult, can that almost sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Where we start to, by labeling that baby that way, we begin to almost accentuate certain characteristics. But a baby born with a more challenging temperament gets aroused more easily. They get upset more easily. They tend to cry more. They tend to be somewhat harder to calm down when they're upset. They may be slower to get onto a schedule. And they do present more real-life challenges to a parent. There's a saying in child psych that if your firstborn child was an easy temperament, you often want to have another kid right away. And vice versa, if your firstborn child had a difficult genetic temperament, you might want to delay having another child because you're feeling overwhelmed with the demands of the first one. Now, it might sound bad to have a difficult temperament, and it is more challenging, but actually that could be a good thing later in life. Children who are born with more difficult temperaments sometimes become, when they become older children and adolescents, they don't get pushed around as easily as the sweet, the easy temperament kids. There's a third temperament that the research suggests, and that third temperament is called the slow to warm up temperament, aka the anxious temperament. Some babies, right from birth, have a genetic program where anything novel or new tends to disturb them. They tend to respond with a kind of an anxious, scared, fearful response. And they tend to withdraw when they're faced with something novel. As they get familiar with it, they're kind of move toward it again, but their initial reaction to anything new is to kind of anxiously back up. Now, what were most of us? Most of us had what are called a mixed temperament, where none of these clear patterns were prominent. We were a blend of all three. Should have started by telling you I'm referencing here the work of a developmental psychologist named Stella Chess, Chess. She was a psychologist who did some of the really good, thorough research on looking at this genetic inborn temperament. Remember again, though, no matter what temperament you're born with, environment, childhood experiences, your parents, where you go to school, the way you're treated by the world can alter that temperament in certain ways. So temperament is genetic, but it's not fixed in cement, especially early in childhood. All right, so we're going to divide prenatal development into 3 stages. And this is standard stuff that you'll see in all intro psych textbooks. It helps us think about what's going on when we think of development. Prenatal is a 9-month process divided into stages. The first stage is called the zygotic stage, Zygotic. And this stage is over so quickly, many women don't even know they're pregnant at this point. The zygotic stage only lasts from the moment of conception through the end of week 2. So it really is only the first 2 weeks of prenatal development. And there's a lot to know about it, if you're going into this field of medicine, but for our purposes in intro, the real takeaway is during the zygotic stage, this is when the zygote, which is the fertilized egg cell, needs to implant on the uterine wall. This is when a placenta needs to develop. A placenta, Placenta, is the interface between what's going on in the mother's body, placenta, and what's going on in the zygote's body. Now, that zygote is going to get renamed an embryo and then renamed a fetus, right? But the placenta is the organ that connects the mother's blood supply in the mother's body with the zygotic embryonic blood supply, right? So developing a healthy placenta is obvious, right? Years ago, it was believed that the placenta was an incredibly effective filter. It was once believed that a pregnant woman didn't need to worry all that much about her lifestyle and what she was putting into her own body because the placenta would protect the fetus. We know that that's wrong. The placenta does have a protective function. That partly is true. But what's in the mother's blood supply can sometimes go through the placenta into the fetal blood supply or the embryonic blood supply. And largely it has to do with the size of the molecule. Bacteria is much, much, much larger than viruses. So it is indeed true that when there's bacteria in the mother's blood supply, that bacteria will often not be able to get through the placenta and make it into the fetal blood supply. Viruses are different. We are talking about viruses again, right? A virus, being so much smaller than a bacterium, is able sometimes to move through the placenta and from the mother's body into the fetus's body. And that virus, obviously, to use that as an example, can sometimes have negative effects on prenatal development. Alcohol is a very small molecule. When mom drinks, so does the developing fetus, right? So because the alcohol molecules are so small, they can move through that placenta. And actually, the placenta sometimes concentrates the amount of certain chemicals into the fetal blood supply. Hence, the expression you've all heard that if it's at all possible that you might be pregnant, you might want to live your lifestyle as if you are pregnant and take good care of yourself so you can take good care of a developing fetus. So back to the zygotic stage, right? It's over by the end of the second week. If things go well, the zygote has implanted on the uterine wall and a placenta has developed. And if things go wrong during this stage, it will almost always result in what is called a spontaneous abortion, i.e. a miscarriage. And one way to think of that is this is the body's way of shutting down a situation where that human being would not possibly be able to survive and function in the world. Okay. The second of the three stages is called the embryonic stage. So as a human being moves out of the zygotic stage, and in the beginning of the third week of pregnancy, we realize again, a lot of women still don't necessarily know they're pregnant at this point. It is now called an embryo. And this stage is over very quickly. It runs from the beginning of the third week to the end of the 8th week. Right? So by the time a woman is 2 months pregnant, she's already moving out of the embryonic stage and into the third stage, which is called the fetal stage, and that's the longest stage. The embryonic stage is extremely powerful. It is a time of tremendously rapid cell division. It is a time when all of the organ systems of the body are developing. And development follows two specific rules during the embryonic stage. The embryo develops from top to bottom. The head develops first and then heading south. That is called, get this word, cephalocaudal. cephalocaudal. Cephalo, head, caudal, bottom. So embryonic development always goes from top to bottom, cephalocaudal, right? The brain is one of the first organs to begin to significantly develop during the embryonic stage. The second rule is that development goes from the center of the body out to the fringes, out to the hands and out to the arms and hands. Center develops first, then outward. And that is called proximo-distal. Proximo-distal. That's one word. And again, this is in your book. Proximo-center, distal fringes. So development goes from top to bottom, cephalocaudal, from center to periphery, proximo-distal. Right? The embryonic stage is a time when the nervous system is developing tremendously. So for example, I think you've all heard of the Zika virus, Zika, right? The Zika virus can affect a pregnant woman's during the embryonic stage, in which the cortex, the outer covering of the brain that we talked about weeks ago, where the smart you lives, does not develop. And babies who were born having been exposed to the Zika virus during the embryonic stage will be born with a brain that lacks cortex development. And if it's not there, it's not going to ever be there. And that means low IQ, significant cognitive impairments. If something goes wrong significantly during the embryonic stage, it will often result in major birth defects, big birth defects. And I just gave you an example with Zika. Another example would be Accutane, Accutane. Accutane, I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Accutane is a prescription drug, and it is to treat severe acne, not mild acne, but severe acne. It's actually a derivative of vitamin A, which makes it sound safe, but it is not. Accutane is a major teratogen, Teratogen. It has major effects on a developing embryo. And that's why with Accutane, many docs simply won't prescribe it to women of childbearing age, or will prescribe it, but only under very strict sorts of conditions, because it's so famous as a very, very powerful teratogen. Okay, so the third stage is called the fetal stage. And this runs from week 9 all the way through, if it's a full term, week 38. The fetal stage is a time when a developing fetus becomes much, much, much larger and gains a significant amount of weight. The different organ systems will continue to develop during the fetal stage. The nervous system is not fully developed by the end of the embryonic stage. There's still a lot of wiring in the brain that needs to take place through the fetal stage. And if something goes wrong during the fetal stage, if it's especially during the early part of the fetal stage, let's say weeks 9 through 13, it can still lead to major birth defects. Later on in the fetal stage, if things go wrong, there can still be problems, but they tend to be generally more considered minor birth defects. Now, minor is through the eye of the beholder. That doesn't mean it's a non-issue. We know that, for example, women who smoke or vape during pregnancy, one of the things that we'll see is a fetus is more likely to be born underweight and slightly prematurely. And that's a big deal, because even though it's considered minor, can that affect the survivability of that newborn human being? And the answer is yes, it can. There also seems to be a link between nicotine, which is a small molecule, it's going to move through the placenta, and increased likelihood in children to have learning disabilities and ADD and ADHD. That's a little bit controversial. Not everybody believes that the case. But there does seem to be some good evidence that that's probably so. Okay, again, let me refer you to the book. There's more there for you to know about. So let me just make sure you take a look there. So thinking about those 3 stages, right? There's something really important called the paradox of the first trimester. So full term is 9 months. Let's divide those months into 3 trimesters. The first 3 months, the second 3 months, and the last 3 months. The paradox of the first trimester basically means that the greatest risks for that developing human being are in the first 3 months of prenatal development, from conception to approximately the 12th or 13th week prenatally. And why is it a paradox? Because that's the time when some women don't even realize they're pregnant, right? Now, in modern America, you can go to the store and pick up a pregnancy test, right? But are there a lot of parts in the world where it doesn't work that way? Or even in America, could there be reasons psychologically why a woman might be in a bit of a denial and might not recognize that she's pregnant early on? Or maybe her menstrual cycle is not a highly predictable one for her, right? The time of greatest risk is the first 3 months, and it's also the time when some women don't even know that they're pregnant. And that's the paradox. And that's why the saying, once again, is if there's any possibility you could be pregnant, live your life as if you are pregnant. Take good care of yourself so that developing human being can emerge 9 months later being healthy. Okay. We're at 26 minutes. I just want to talk about one more piece of prenatal development that I think is important. And it's a term that I used about 5 minutes ago. That term is teratogen, Teratogen. The word teratogen, I'm just looking at my cell phone that's telling me I'm supposed to be at an online meeting. That's not going to happen. The term teratogen refers to any substance that could negatively affect prenatal development, whether it's a zygote, embryo, or fetus, it doesn't matter. And there are a number of different things out there in the world that can abnormally affect prenatal development, sometimes in a more minor way and sometimes in an utterly catastrophic way. It's useful to divide teratogens down into categories. So let me just give you the 4 big categories. Number 1, infections. When a woman is pregnant, certain types of infections that she can get can move through the placental barrier and into the developing zygote or embryo or fetus. And I gave you an example before. The Zika virus is an example of an infection that can move from mother to developing fetus. Another famous one is German measles. German measles, when a woman is pregnant and gets German measles, especially in the first 3 months of her pregnancy, that can lead to abnormal prenatal development in her fetus. There are others like HIV can affect the fetus, and there's many. The second group are recreational drugs. We already talked about nicotine, right? Nicotine, small molecule, goes into the developing human being, the embryo, the fetus, and does seem to be correlated with an increased risk of learning disabilities and ADD, ADHD. Now, let's be real clear. Could mom have lived a pure, straight-up, clean lifestyle? Could you still wind up with ADD or ADHD or learning disabilities? Yes, right? So I'm not saying there's a perfect cause effect there. And remember, in research, a correlation between 2 variables does not prove cause and effect. There's some connection, but it doesn't mean that A causes B. Alcohol, famous, right? Years ago, docs would say to a pregnant woman, if you have 1 or 2 glasses of wine a day, don't worry, it's not going to affect your fetus. There's not a lot of obstetricians who are going to say that anymore. Some of that's a cover your ass reason, but it's a small molecule. So when a pregnant woman drinks, the fetus is getting alcohol into his or her bloodstream, and alcohol has an affinity for central nervous system. So a woman who drinks a great deal during her pregnancy can produce a child with fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome, alcohol as a teratogen has done dozens of different things to the body. Fetal alcohol syndrome doesn't just affect brain development, it affects facial development, there's all kinds of things going on with that. Obviously, cocaine has a significant effect on fetal development. So do lots of drugs people take recreationally. And there's a section in the book that I'd like to direct you to that talks more about that in particular. The third group of teratogens are called toxins. These are environmental hazards. The most famous that have been studied are heavy metal, nothing to do with music, lead and mercury, even in minute amounts in a pregnant woman's body, will move through the placental barrier. And lead and mercury, heavy metals, have an affinity in a developing fetus to wind up in the brain. Lead exposure prenatally is absolutely associated with abnormal brain development and loss of intellectual ability. So of course, there's concerns about pregnant women who live in older homes where, generations back, lead paint was used commonly, right? And it's not even lead that you could see visibly. It's microscopic particles of lead that are in the air that when mom breathes in, she's breathing in that lead, and it is moving from her body into the prenatal body. So while there's other ones, other toxins, certainly lead and mercury, heavy metal poisoning is a big deal. And there are tests that can be given to measure the amount of lead. So if a pregnant woman is in an area, living in an area where there's likely been historically exposure to lead, that's one of those things that needs to be looked at. And then the fourth and final category are prescription medications. And I already gave you one, Accutane, which is again used to treat severe acne. One of the most famous ones that was prescribed in Europe in the 1960s, and it was also prescribed off-label in the United States, but not as much, was a drug called thalidomide, Thalidomide. Thalidomide was prescribed for women who were pregnant and who were at risk for having a miscarriage. It was not adequately tested before it became a legitimate drug. What thalidomide did was thalidomide affected fetuses differently. It didn't affect brain development. It affected the development of the extremities, of arms and legs. And so thalidomide babies, and if you go to Wikipedia, you can look this up, right? Thalidomide babies, which are now people well into their 50s and or moving into their 60s, were born either without arms or legs or with a primitive sort of hand coming right out of the arm, right? Where the arm itself never developed. Right? And thalidomide was really important sociologically and legally because it showed the dangers of moving a drug to market too rapidly without it being sufficiently tested first to see if it was a teratogen. Right? So Accutane, thalidomide, there's a number of other drugs, prescription meds. And that's why when a woman is, on a regular medication, her doc wants to know if there's any possibility that she could be pregnant or it wants to become pregnant, because that's a discussion that needs to take place. And it's a hard one sometimes because one of the drugs to treat bipolar disorder is a drug called lithium. I mean, lithium is an element, right? It's like iron. But it has an anti-bipolar, anti-manic effect. It's been known for years. And for some folks with bipolar disorder, some women with bipolar disorder, lithium really keeps a lid on the manic episode. But when you get pregnant, there's a case to be made that you shouldn't stay on lithium. And so, you know that old story, right? You get kind of caught between a rock and a hard place sometimes. You may need the medication to stabilize and solve one problem, but it could function as a teratogen. And if you're pregnant, of course, you don't want to do that. So we get squeezed. Life can be hard. Okay, so if we just stop for a minute and reflect on this last 35 minutes now, this is all prenatal development. What's coming after this, later this week, is we're going to talk about, I think what I'm going to do next will be personality development. I want to talk a little bit about how important childhood and adolescence is in establishing who we are going to be for the rest of our lives. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about Erikson's theory of personality development, especially for those of us living in America, and Western Europe. Erikson had a lot of really useful things to say about how childhood experience uh, influences the way we become who we are. I also want to talk next lecture a little bit about attachment, the things that need to happen in the early months between a parent and a newborn infant. If attachment goes well, if things happen the way they're supposed to, that relationship in infancy, it bodes well for the rest of our lives, or unfortunately, sometimes vice versa. So that's where it's going. I sent everybody just a little while ago, I sent everybody in Intro Psych an email with an attachment. Please read it and reach out to me. Anything I can do to be of help. Part of that attachment tells you that there's obviously a take-home exam a couple of weeks down the road, and read it. You'll see what I mean, and we'll talk more about that as we get closer to it. All right, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.